Welcome back to the newest episode of the Thinking Jew podcast, where we dive deep in Torah and Jewish philosophy, always uncovering new layers of depth we did not realize existed beforehand. I'm your host, Rabbi Moshe Siegel, coming to you from Richardson, Texas. And as always, if you want to reach me, my email address is thethinkingjewpodcast@gmail.com. We're now in the middle of a time period connecting Pesach and Shavuos, known as the Omer. On a practical level, there's a mitzvah to count the days and the weeks of the Omer. You could find a basic Sfirat HaOmer calendar if you just Google it. And the concept basically is that every single night between Pesach and Shavuos, for these 50 days, we count and say tonight is X amount of nights, which is equal to Y weeks and Z days of the counting of the Omer. And every night we add one more day until we get to the final counting right before Shavuos. If you look in the Torah, the source of this mitzvah is found in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 10, where the Torah explains that there was a special service called the Korban Omer, the Omer offering, which was a barley offering of the new grain, and it was brought on the second day of Passover. The Torah then continues in those verses, in verse 15, and commands us to count 50 days from this Omer offering, and on the 50th day, bring a new wheat-based offering called the Shtei Halechem, or the two breads. Continue to verse 21, and the Torah tells us that this 50th day, on which we bring this new offering of the two breads, is actually a Yom Tov, it's a holiday, which we can't do work on like all the other holidays. Referring to the holiday, which we call nowadays Shavuos. The word Shavuos, or Shavuot, means weeks, referring to these 7 weeks of counting that led up to this holiday. There's a lot of very strange questions that really come up from these verses. I'll just throw out a couple of them. First off, why is the Omer offering brought in the middle of Pesach? It seems like somehow it's connected to Pesach, but if you read the verse in the Torah, it doesn't really have any connection to Pesach other than it's brought on the second day of Pesach. Secondly, why was the Omer offering using barley? Barley is generally not used in other sacrifices in the temple. So why was this one specifically composed of barley? And I think maybe the most glaring question is, why is the holiday of Shavuos so secondary in the Torah? It doesn't even get its own section here. It seems to just be the 50th day of the Omer, on which we happen to bring a new sacrifice on it, the sacrifice of the two breads. And it doesn't even mention anywhere that it's the day we got the Torah on. Does Shavuos not have its own inherent value beyond just the day that we brought a new sacrifice on? And also, isn't it weird that the holiday of Shavuos doesn't have a date in the Torah? Every holiday has a date. The Torah says on the first day of the 7th month, that's Rosh Hashanah, on the 10th day of the 7th month, Yom Kippur, 15th, Sukkot, on the 15th day of the 1st month, that's Passover. Every holiday in the Torah is given a date and a month in which it falls. But for some reason, Shavuos doesn't have that. Shavuos is just based on 50 days after the Omer offering. You have this day of Shavuos. Why doesn't the Torah establish a date for the holiday of Shavuos? So let's dive in a little bit and try to understand what exactly the Omer offering represents and how it creates this connection and serves as this bridge between Passover and Shavuos. So let's start with the holiday of Passover. We all know that Passover is the holiday of freedom. We were taken out of our Egyptian bondage and set free. We all sat a few weeks ago at our Pesach Seder telling over the story of the Exodus to our family or whoever we were around. Now there's something very interesting about this freedom. If you look in the Torah, in the earlier parts of the story, God commands Moses to go to Pharaoh many times and request the Jews' freedom. And we all know the famous line Moses said, made famous by Charlton Heston and many others. Moses stands up in front of Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Or so Hollywood would like you to think. But if you look in the Torah, that's actually only half of the line that Moses says. Moses says every single time another half to that line. He says, "Shalach esami, let my people go, via avduni, and they shall serve me." Or "Vayachog li b'midbar, they shall celebrate with me in the desert." There's always a second half. It's always, let my people go so that they can serve Hashem. The freedom requested and eventually actualized wasn't just a removing of the shackles of Egyptian slavery, but it was actually an entering into the covenant with God. It wasn't just a freedom from, but it was a freedom towards, the freedom to go and connect to God. The purpose of the Exodus wasn't just to get us out of Egypt, but it was so that we should be able to get to Mount Sinai and receive the Torah, to get to that point of relationship and connection to Hashem. So we see already in its earliest inception, before the whole Exodus story happens, just when Moses is speaking to Pharaoh, there's this strong connection between what Passover, the holiday commemorating our Exodus and freedom, and Shavuos, the holiday commemorating the receiving of the Torah, represent. They're both deeply connected together in their purpose. Now let's look at the Omer offering for a minute. The Omer is brought from barley, like we mentioned. And there's only one other offering in the Torah that's also brought from barley. And that's the offering of the sota, or the errant wife, a woman who's accused of adultery, has a certain process to prove either her innocence or her guilt. And in that process, she brings a korban, she brings an offering, and it also has barley in it. And the Maharal, who we've quoted on this podcast many times, the great Jewish philosopher and Kabbalist of the 16th century, explains that historically, barley was always animal fodder. The sota brings an offering of barley because adultery is an act following the animalistic drive of man and not representing the higher side of humankind. The barley of the Omer, explains the Maharal, also connects to the physical, animalistic side of man. And from this barley offering, we count 50 days leading us up to the offering of the shtei halechem, of the two breads. This offering was composed of wheat, which the Maharal explains is the bread of man, representing the higher level man can attain beyond his animalistic impulses. So if we take a step back and start putting things together, here's where we end up. On Pesach, on Passover, we left Egypt, gaining our physical freedom. Our bodies, our physical selves were no longer enslaved, and we immediately started preparing for the Mount Sinai experience, which will take place 50 days later. So on this holiday of Passover, as soon as the first day of Yom Tov is over, on the very next day, we bring an offering of barley. We start the process of building ourselves towards accepting the Torah. And Shavuos doesn't need its own date on the calendar, because it really is not its own holiday. It's the culmination of our freedom that started with the Exodus. And like we mentioned, it wasn't just a freedom from physical bondage, but it was a freedom towards connecting to Hashem in the deepest way. So on Pesach itself, which represents the more physical expression of freedom, we bring a sacrifice, an offering of barley, representing the physical side of man. And we then take that and we work on ourselves. And for the next 50 days, we work on ourselves more and more until we get to the point that we're ready to hear the voice of God Himself at Mount Sinai, which is represented by the wheat offerings of Shavuos, representing the higher elevated side of human beings. So as we go through this special time period that we're in, the counting of the Omer, it's really a unique time for reflection and growth. A time to think about how we're blessed to not just be barley eating animals following our instincts and urges, but rather we're humans, and we have the power to overcome and to persevere and to take ourselves to endless spiritual heights, to the deepest connections to Hashem available. I give us all a blessing that we should merit using this time successfully to really grow and become the great people that we're all able to become. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Thinking Jew podcast. If you did, I ask you, please drop a rating, drop a review so we can get others to discover this podcast as well. As always, if you have any questions or comments, topic requests, feel free to reach out to me at thethinkingjewpodcast@gmail.com.